When exporting from Rhino to AutoCAD, there's a couple of things that we need to know about how we're going to actually export the geometry from Rhino and into AutoCAD. So here we're really just going to be looking at how to export curves. We're not going to be looking at surfaces or meshes or anything like that. So when we go to export selected and then we go to save a file, we're going to see that we have a bunch of options pop up here. So we have default 2007 lines, 2007 natural, 2007 polylines, and then a couple of other options that we're not really going to cover here. So default lines, natural, and polylines we'll take a look at here. So I'm going to take a look at edit schemes here, and this is going to give us a little bit of insight into the type of file that we're actually going to get out of Rhino and into AutoCAD. So if we go from general, we're going to take a look at curves here. So this is going to give us some information on how it's actually going to divide up the geometry. So lines will import into AutoCAD as lines, arcs as arcs, polylines as polylines. And then two things here that to note. So curves and polycurves. So specifically here, this arc is going to import as a spline. And splines are notoriously difficult to deal with in AutoCAD. So there's a couple of ways around that. So let's take a look at lines. Here, everything is going to import as a line. Our maximum angle is basically how it's going to divide up our geometry that's curved, which we'll get into in a minute. If we go into 2007 natural, we'll see some different things. So lines, arcs, and polylines stay the same. Curves will be spines, and then polycurves will be polylines with bulge arcs. And we'll take a look at what that looks like. That's basically going to be the circle. And then 2007 polylines will make everything into a polyline. Again, we have a maximum angle that we'll talk about. And we'll talk about what explode polycurves will do. So I have some examples set up in AutoCAD, so we'll just go ahead and open. So this is the first one we exported, which was default. So we see our outside rectangle imports as a polyline. This imports as an actual circle, so it has an actual center that we can move from. These are what those bulge arcs are called, so we can actually do something like that. And then this imports as a spline, and the way that you can tell it's a spline without even checking its properties or anything is you can take a look at these circles here. So you see how these are squares and these are circles. That's going to tell you that it's a spline right off the bat. So we can also go into our properties and we'll see here that it says spline. So these are notoriously difficult to deal with. They can't be trimmed or moved or snapped to like traditional lines. So if we look into our lines file, we'll see that it actually exploded our rectangle. And then it did something really strange to our circle here. So you can see that this is actually made up of individual line segments. And that maximum angle setting that we looked at was basically how long these line segments were going to be. So we set a maximum angle of 2. So that means that the maximum degree between any of these lines is 2 degrees. And then it will automatically make a new line. Same thing happened here. So every 2 degrees, it made it into a new line. If we look at something like natural, in this sense, it's going to look very, very similar to what our default did. The main difference is it does a lot better with, if we had filleted corners or anything like that, it would traditionally do that a little bit better than our default setting would. The problem a lot of times with natural is that it's going to yield if any of these are close to full circles or something like that, it will automatically default them to actual circles. And then we'll look at polylines. So this is actually making a closed line, but it's still, as you can see, multiple segments. So there's actually no center to this. And then we can look at this and it's making these into individual segments. So if we go back into Rhino, we're going to look at some other settings. So explode polycurves. By default, for some reason, in your 2007 polylines, this is actually checked. So if we go again and we go into these schemes and we go to edit schemes, and then we go to curves. In your polylines one, you're going to want to uncheck explode polycurves. I've already done that. And then your maximum angle, you can change that depending on how much detail you actually need in this thing. So my recommendation here would be if you're exporting to something like Illustrator straight from Rhino and you're using a DWG to do that, use your default setting. The fact that these are splines don't actually matter because it's just going to default to regular old lines in Illustrator. If you're doing something that you need to then edit in AutoCAD, I would tend to go with this 2007 natural setting. That will allow you to deal with things like circles as actual circles without having them be subdivided. And then for certain fabrication-based things, I would say polylines is the way to go. Splines are very cut a little bit differently on things like laser cutters, so polylines would be the setting for that. So default if you're exporting to Illustrator, natural typically if you're exporting to AutoCAD, to do a lot of editing. You can also do default and just see how many things are actually spines and see how much of a big deal it's going to be. We can take a look real quick just at how you would edit this thing if it was a spine. So the first thing that we would want to do is we can do a P edit, and then it's going to ask if we want to turn it into a polyline, and we can click yes. And then that will actually turn this into something that's a bit more editable. It's just not going to import as an arc or something like that, so it will be a little bit faceted, so just something to keep in mind there. So those are the basic settings. Another nice thing about this is if you go to export and you go to options, edit schemes, you can also do a save as. So if you do a bunch of edits, you can save it as a new export scheme to make a totally custom one for yourself. You can also change which version of AutoCAD and how different objects are going to export to the AutoCAD environment.